So when the great foe Morgoth destroyed the very light of our home, we resisted. And a legion of elves went to war. We left Valinor, our home, and journeyed to a distant realm. One filled with untold perils and strange creatures beyond count. A place known as Middle-earth. They said it would be over quickly. But the war left Middle-earth in ruin. And would last centuries. Now, we learned many words for death. In the end, Morgoth would be defeated, but not before much sorrow. For his orcs had spread to every corner of Middle-earth, multiplying ever greater under the command of his most devoted servant, a cruel and cunning sorcerer. They called him Sauron. My brother vowed to seek him out and destroy him. But Sauron found him first.
Gang, we're back.
Here we go.
Welcome to the Imaginarium. We're back talking about Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, the TV show. I'm Dr. Eric Goodwin.
Oh boy.
Clinical associate professor, University of Washington, Billings Clinic. And I'm here with my fellow journeyman of the soul, Nick
Hello, sir.
Iafredi.
Nick Iafredi, certified hypnotherapist, journeyman of the soul, as
Exactly.
both you and I are. Big convo today.
Yeah, I've got a lot. There's a lot to discuss and unpack here with this show. I was huge amount of hype around it, and of course we're going to dive into our opinions and feelings about the show, which are strong, both positive and maybe even negative. But we'll see. But of course, here at the Imaginarium, I always want to go one step deeper. I don't want to just say, "Hey, I liked it, and here's why." I want to say, "What do I think is really going on? What about the cultural phenomena surrounding this show and other expressions of fantasy and science fiction? These are expressions of the imagination, and expressions of the imagination are reflections of current problems and issues. So I always think that's relevant. We tend to think, some people tend to think of fantasy as just pure escapism, but it's not. It's a reflection of what's on our mind at the deepest level. Now, Jung talked about the spirit of the depths versus the spirit of the times. So the spirit of the times is what everybody's chattering on and on and on about, but the spirit of the depths is what is the emotional, deep issues that we're grappling with, that we're trying to make sense of in this time. So just a short recap, Rings of Power, in case you've been living under a rock for the last 100 years, is a TV show based on the appendices of The Return of the King by J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, paid for by a monumental sum by Amazon Studios, $1 billion estimated. It is supposed to run 50 hours total. The showrunners say that they've got a complete story set up. So I found that to be encouraging after given our experience with not only what I've heard about Game of Thrones and how that went completely haywire after they ran out of source material, and also the Star Wars sequel trilogy, which they didn't seem to have any sort of game plan for. But these guys, they apparently do. They base it not only on the appendices, but also in collaboration with Simon Tolkien, the grandson of the big guy himself. That's an interesting story in and of itself. Simon Tolkien apparently has come out as saying that the Peter Jackson trilogy caused a huge rift in their family because Christopher Tolkien, being the purist that he was, didn't like them, didn't want to have anything to do with them, but not everybody in the family agreed with that, including his firstborn son, I think his only son. I'm not sure exactly about that, but Simon. So Simon Tolkien, who is a successful novelist in his own right, has been collaborating with the showmakers to try to make it on point. So that's interesting. So as I understand it, this show is not part of the Peter Jackson verse. It is, of course, based on the story, but but it's not officially part of that lineage, as it were. Nevertheless, you can tell that they were strongly inspired by the bar that Peter Jackson set, which is extremely high. Now, I got to say though, that it's interesting that there's so much reverence heaped upon the original trilogy, the Peter Jackson trilogy. When it first came out, there was a ton of trepidation over it, and there was a ton of butthurt over it when it first came out. The Fellowship of the Ring first came out, which in my opinion is probably the perfect movie, like period. The Fellowship. The other two are still stupendously great, but I don't think they quite match the perfection of the first one. That's just my take. And I think it's because the pressure was so high. All we had before that was the Bakshi version, the animated disaster, which I still have kind of a sneaky affection for, just because it's nostalgia. I saw it in the theater with my dad, and he was utterly mystified by the fact that they stopped halfway through the story and said, "Join us next time for the rest of the story." And, it's like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah.
So anyway, there's that. Some disclaimers I wanted to throw out there. Anyone out there who's listening, are amongst our huge fan base for Yards Around, if they're interested in manufactured rage over the show and or mindless fanboy giggling, they're probably not going to like this video, because we're going to get into it and try to understand a nuanced exploration of this.
Yeah.
This is really important material to a lot of folks. This is my #1 favorite franchise ever. So I mean, we're there, but I'm not going to be one of these guys that just rants on forever about stuff I don't like, and I'm not going to just give them a pass for everything either. So if you don't like that, whatever. Now, I will say right up front, a big fan of the show so far. And so from what I've seen on YouTube, it seems like anybody who comes out and says they like it is immediately accused of being on the Amazon payroll. No, I am totally not. And if you don't believe that, you can go play with yourself, because you're calling me a liar, so screw off. But I'm not. I'm too small for that at this point. So I wanted to just throw out my broad strokes assessment of what I've seen so far, and then open it up for you to say what your take is. I love the show, but I do have a particular approach to fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
I love fantasy in general. Most stuff that comes across my desk, or if I'm watching it or whatever it is, if it's fantasy, I'm typically on board for it. So that said, I did have some skepticism. I love the trailers, but there was some skepticism there. I'm like, are they going to get this right? The toughest thing for me is tone.
Mm-hmm.
If the tone isn't right, I struggle. And even parts of the Peter Jackson trilogy where they go off course there, where the tone is the parts that grate on me. And they diverge a little bit. Tolkien was the master of tone. He absolutely never strayed from it. And so that's one of the things I love about it. And here, I think they, for the most part, they nailed it pretty well. Nevertheless, we will get into how I don't believe you can separate your expectations from the context of the content. And it's something people don't seem to see a whole lot. They go into it and their feeling is entirely placed on the show or whatever it is that they're consuming at the time, rather than giving a thought to, well, how I'm feeling about it going in beforehand affecting how I feel about it, you know? And that's a big difference. That's a big difference. A lot of professional critics talk about this. I know Roger Ebert used to talk about this a lot, how he would watch a movie and then realize that he was being negative towards it because it wasn't what he thought it was supposed to be, rather than what it actually was. And that's not quite fair, but you know. But I don't typically go in on my first watch of something like this really worrying a whole lot about the plot or the details. I go for the imagery, the feel, the symbols, the emotionality of it, and then when I go back to it, I go, okay, so that's what's going on here, and here's this plot point, and you know, that kind of stuff. So that's probably different than what a lot of people do. But for me, fantasy is about immersion in another world, and an imaginative world, and does it make sense on an emotional, like kind of abstract level, and then I get into the nitty-gritty. And on that level, I liked it a lot. But what about your thoughts about it so far?
So just like you are a fan of the show and you're not kind of bought out by Amazon, I'm not a huge fan of the show, but I'm not a racist. So there's that. There's that.
Oh, we're gonna get into that.
Yeah,
stuff.
we'll get into that.
We are gonna get into that.
Yeah, but no, I've watched I've watched both episodes a couple times now, and I do appreciate the visuals of it. I wish there was a little bit more practical effects, but I understand why. I mean, it's $1 billion show, but therein lies the issue with me. It's $1 billion show, and I felt like it was really pretty. I didn't particularly enjoy the writing. There were certain things happening between characters that I was just like, this is not it. And I thought that throughout the entirety of their marketing, you know, both showrunners were very adamant in saying, like, you know, this is true to the source material, this, that, and the other. But there are certain things about it that I'm just like, Tolkien explicitly said what he said, and it's the complete opposite. And mostly timeline stuff for me.
Yeah.
That's honestly my biggest issue. It's just, I'm looking at certain points that the show is like almost like accumulating thousands of years and just condensing it into this time. And I'm like, I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah.
Because like you,
absolutely.
I am a huge Tolkien fan. Tolkien was it is my kind of like go-to when it comes to fantasy imagination. I mean, Tolkien was really an author for me that introduced me not only to high fantasy, but also different metaphysical ideas, you know, and stuff like that. It was almost like a rabbit hole. So yeah, I'm not particularly too optimistic about it. But that's not to say that I'm not going to kind of give it time to see where it goes.
We've got 48 hours to go.
Yeah, apparently.
It's a long trip.
A long one. Yeah.
If you can stay with it that long, you know, it may frustrate you too much, but those are great points. So they had a really difficult line to ride with the show for two reasons. One is that the source material is very sketched, it's very skeletal for a 50-hour show. So they had to figure out how they were going to work that into a television show. It's a different medium from a written, you know, text. And then the other part of it was that they didn't have the rights to the Silmarillion. Nope. So even though we have some scenes from the First Age, they had to dance around certain things like the names of the two trees. They can't tell us that, and all that kind of stuff, you know. I didn't think they were going to even be able to mention the Silmarils, but they did in the second episode, of course. So I was like, oh, okay, that might have been, you know, that might have been Simon Tolkien's, you know, contribution to this. So yeah, I'll let that go. I don't know. So it was very tough. So they had to make some really tough challenging decisions. The time compression is definitely something you're going to have to either accept or just dismiss entirely. And it's like, I can't deal with this because they're going with it. I'm pretty sure they're going to have to compress most of like a lot of what happens in the second age down to a much smaller period of time, because I'm betting why they did that, just as a kind of amateur storyteller myself, they didn't want to have to continually kill off the human characters because they're dying.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this stuff happens over centuries. If at the end of the second episode they're getting ready to show up in Numenor, well, I mean, there's centuries of crap that happens there before the Last Alliance. If she runs right into Elendil, I'm like, okay, so we're really condensing things down here, and we're not going to deal with Al-Pharazôn or any of those guys, right? It's just going to be Elendil, Isildur, bam, that may be what they're doing. So that I'm not a huge fan of that myself either, but I'm not real sure how else they might have been able to do it and still have it flow like a typical TV show does, where you're not jumping across centuries. I think that might have been too much for a $1 billion, enterprise.
Well,
it's a defensible choice, but it's not necessarily one I like that much.
Well, also like certain characters. I mean, Isildur wasn't born; he was born after the Rings of Power, right? Came in, and Isildur is apparently going to be a main character coming from Numenor,
right?
It's stuff like that. I think if my biggest issue with it is, yes, the time stuff is there, and I understand all those points that you made. I think they're actually really valid. It's that the showrunners don't recognize that. They don't explicitly say, "Hey guys, listen, this is not. We are doing the best with the 150 pages that we have at the appendices."
Yeah.
And I think that's where, for me, it's just kind of like, why are you being disingenuous about what you're actually doing? Like, no, like Isildur wasn't around. Galadriel never went to Numenor, right? Where's Celeborn? Were they in Aragorn? Where's their daughter? Is Elrond going to end up being their son-in-law like he is? Where is all this? So
how is all this pieced together? How are they going to do that? That's a question of, and I think, well, we'll get into this later, but a lot of this has to do with the level of trust in the showrunners and the writers. As if your trust level is really low, every little thing like that is going to grate on your nerves, and if it's relatively high, and I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise, which is probably why I have a pretty high tolerance for shenanigans in fantasy. Guilty until proven innocent, or as some people approach it. I'm trying to be the other way around, but that's a valid question, right? I mean, how are they going to work all that stuff in? Are they going to just completely derail the canon, as it were? Or are they going to try to make it fit somehow? They have mentioned several times that they are having to compress time, but they're vague about what that means. And it looks to me like they're going to be compressing a lot of time.
Yeah.
So you either go with it or you don't. So what did you think about? I'm just going to go through a couple of points of the show and just get your thoughts about, like the Harfoots, for example. What do you think of them?
All right. Well, Tolkien has literally said that they are hobbits. The showrunners said that they're not hobbits. So I'm just like, all right, okay, guys, like, what's going on there? And so another like, why not? They just admit it for what it is. It's because they don't have the rights. But I thought, I remember texting you. I was kind of like meh with the Harfoots. It really, there was one scene in particular when they were all coming out of their hiding places. I did actually enjoy that. It reminded me. It got that Hobbit feel, that innocence.
The kind of Celtic fairies kind of feel to it. Like coming out of the trees and the holes in the ground and all that. And now, if I'm not mistaken, that the hobbits are divided up into like Harfoots and Stoors, and there's another group I can't remember, but and those were in existence during the Second Age, and I guess they're just going to that. But like you say, why not just call them hobbits? Because that's what they are, clearly. I don't know, but I like that scene. that I actually really love the whimsy that they have. One of the things that's kind of jarring about the show right now, and I guess we'll get into this a little bit later, but the pacing is very choppy because they're going here and then they're way over here and then they're way over here, and that's something I really gets on my nerves when I'm reading fantasy novels. Like Brandon Sanderson, it really does this a lot. He drives me crazy. Let's talk about this guy for 2 chapters, and then we're going to go some way over on the other side of the continent with some dude I've never even heard of, and we're going to go talk about them for a while. Like, what about the other guys, you know? And and they're, you know, you can get away with that in a TV show more, and that might be why that type of writing is more popular now, because of the influence of TV. But here it is still even so kind of jarring. I'm assuming that the characters are going to blend together later on, and there's going to be some kind of common thread other than just they all looked up and saw the meteor, you know, at the end of the first episode. But you know, other than that, I like the Irish accents, and I like the fact that they're very earthy and nomadic. And I thought the character that played Nori Brandyfoot was really convincing. Now, as I remember, before we started talking about this, just kind of preliminary discussions, you said you didn't care much for the characterization of Galadriel, so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. You didn't like that at all, I guess.
You're going right into it, man. You're going right.
Yeah. I wanted to get your opinion, a strong opinion, I guess.
It seemed as though they were trying to set her up as this kind of. I mean, well, all right. First and foremost, the elves didn't seem like elves to me. They seemed like too human, right? There's this certain level of kind of almost divine, elegant stoicism when I read elves, right? Specifically with Tolkien, I found like they were and I think that's the fault of the writing. They were needlessly humanized in a certain way, right? They're supposed essentially angels to a certain degree, right? The Valar, but that's the first thing. The second thing was I can't help but look at her setup as a character and saying that when have I ever read Galadriel as being like this kind of outcast within the elven people, as always being against the kind of stream? And I never have. And I can appreciate that they want to develop a character that is almost like this underdog, but you have to, in my opinion, you have to make that character likable. And at no point during the first 2 episodes did I actually say to myself, I actually enjoy her as a character. And I think you brought up the kind of the choppiness of the pacing of it. I think they could have probably made her more likable if they focused on her throughout the first 2 episodes. Instead of being so sporadic and all over the place. I think if they really gave her emotional depth, you know, the loss of her brother. And again, you can get into the fact that I think she has like 3 other brothers that aren't mentioned at all, you know?
Yeah, right. But again, that's all Silmarillion stuff. They don't even mention.
They don't have it, yeah.
Yeah, that's Finrod. Right. I think most people agree that that's Finrod that's being shown there, which I don't know that actor, but I really liked his portrayal of Finrod. I thought it was very elfy, whereas you know, many of the other characters didn't quite seem to get it perfect, you know. They tried, you know, certainly tried, and that's something, again, we're going to have to just sort of go with, I guess. Like the character who played or the actor who played Celebrimbor, I don't know that actor, and I've not seen him before, but he, you know, he's portraying the character in a particular way that doesn't seem quite like what I have in my head envisioned for Celebrimbor. But again, whose fault is that? Is that mine or is that theirs? I don't know, but well, you know, there it is.
Yeah. And I think for her, I mean, so far, I think I have a big issue with how they're kind of pointing in a certain direction with Gil-galad. I really don't like what they're doing with him if they're going in that direction.
Well, which direction do you think they're taking it? This interesting.
Kind of like, I mean, he's the High King of the Noldor, right? And I feel like there was a scene where he's pretty much reading off what Elrond wrote, right? And he seems like this kind of, there's a certain level of cognitive dissonance with him in terms of saying like, no, it's a time of peace. It's a time of peace. And it's almost like again, like that setup is that you have this very strong underdog female lead who is against this masculine driven, kingdom. And it's not that that can't work, but I've seen it so many times and I don't think it's needed here per se.
So
And
you're
I think
worried there might be trying to turn it into some kind of like a political statement almost.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And I
Well,
think they already go ahead.
I was just going to say, the weird thing about that is that they, at the end, they kind of set it up at the end of what we've seen so far anyway. It seems like they're setting it up for this dynamic between Elrond and Gil-galad, who it's like they're trying to keep the peace, but they do know that something ain't right. And they were just kind of conspiring to get Galadriel out of the picture because she's kind of a loose cannon. That's kind of how I read it. And that, I mean, she is kind of a loose cannon at this point. That's one of the things that I found compelling about her was that intensity to avenge her brother, kind of a Feanor-like, intensity. And she is Feanor's niece, of course, but that's something that she may have to overcome during the arc of the show if they're doing that, if they're going that way, to learn from. And I am wondering if Gil-galad and Elrond are going to have to, come around to certain ways of thinking too. We'll see. I guess we'll see. But there is a potential for that kind of hackneyed narrative of, the female is the one who's wise and knows all, kind of like they've done in Star Wars to a degree.
Yeah.
Where it's, except for the Obi-Wan TV show. Now they did have a nice arc for, I can't remember, Reva. But that's a different dimension. So anyway, so we'll see, I guess, how that plays out. I guess we'll see
how it plays out. Yeah,
we're probably going to be saying that a lot. We'll see how this goes.
By episode 8, we'll see how it goes. We'll see. We'll see where it's going.
Yeah, that's right. Just skip to the end. That's what we say. I do have, for folks out there that don't like the portrayal of her as a warrior and with armor and an excellent fighter and all that kind of stuff, that isn't so far removed from the way Tolkien was describing her at all. I mean, in one of his letters, he said that she's a warrior and an Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
He said
she fought Fëanor. I mean, she fought Fëanor. I mean, like there's a couple of quotes out there that pretty much suggest, like literally saying what you're saying is that, she was a warrior.
So that didn't bother me. I didn't care much for the jump on the sword and leap at the troll move.
Legolas.
This was more, that was like a Peter Jackson moment, like where they're just getting a little goofy with the moves. To me, that's maybe on the level of surfing down stairways on a shield to shoot orcs kind of stuff. Maybe not quite as ridiculous as running across rocks in midair to go kill Bolg. I mean, come on. I know elves are awesome, but dude. But it's another homage to Peter Jackson, I guess. And they're doing that. Howard Shore, incidentally, talking about the music, that just popped into my head. He wrote the theme to the show as well. So it's another tie-in that's not a tie-in, right? It's not official, but it is, but it isn't.
And if you take a look at the Balrog later, I mean, there's going to be a Balrog, right? It looks exactly like the one in
it's totally the same, exact same design.
Yeah.
And the way that Tolkien describes the Balrog is so vague that you could describe it in all kinds of different ways, depict it in so many different ways. And they specifically, of course, chose to pick, and why not, right? It's a great trilogy. It was very well done. So anyway, so let's see. Another thing I found a little tough to get my head around was the use of middle-aged actors to portray some of the older elves, and it just creates this little dissonance in my head. I guess I mainly this is my fault because there's no way a human can portray an elf, because the way Tolkien describes the elves is just beyond human. They're just superhuman. They're so stupendous. But nevertheless, since there aren't any elves that screen for the show, sadly, they got to use humans, and so it all comes out in their mannerisms. And I thought the language was very like poetic and elfy sounding. The dialogue, especially there's a scene where they're in Linden, I believe, and Elrond and Galadriel having this intense conversation about what are you going to do with yourself, right? You need to just go to Valinor and forget about all this, lay down your sword, and right. And she comes back with, I can't do that. I have this, devotion to my brother, et cetera, et cetera. So I like that, but there's got to be some way for the audience to cue into the fact that this is an elf who's maybe a couple thousand years older than the other guy talking to him, So, so like the Watch Warden, Celebrimbor, Gil-galad, portrayed by older actors. I just got to deal with it. I just got to deal with it.
Well, one of the guys in our company that were like where the Ford Waith, right? They were in the Northern Wastes.
Yeah.
I'm like, that guy looks old to be an elf. Like, I was like, this guy's at least in like late 40s, early 50s, and I'm like, all right, okay, this is not something I'm used to, but I get it. All right.
Well, but it's funny because there was that in Jackson's trilogy too, but it was mostly in the background. Like they have Círdan in a very brief shot at the very beginning, where you see him holding one of the rings of power, and he's an older guy, right? And of course, Tolkien describes him as having a beard. Even he's that old. He's just ridiculously old. So what are you going to do? It's not very consistent. They just look like they're in the prime of their life for all eternity, or we're going to use these guys here to visual cue. Okay, they're a little older than the average guy. So that was for the humans in the audience. Yeah. Okay. So, right. Okay, so what about Arondir and Bronwyn? What are your thoughts about that plot line so far? Not convinced, or did you like it? No, yay.
I get it's a weird. I get Occupation of Berlin with that whole thing, right? I get a lot of, we have to keep an eye on these people because they have the potential to still be what they were type thing. Judging them for the history of the past, all that, and I thought
I believe that was intentional. That vibe. I
got kind of when Arondir's in the bar or the tavern, and the young guy is just like, one of you kind of knife ears going to get over it. I got a lot of like kind of like, all right, is he an incel for this or that, and like, is that a commentary on that? Like, that's the vibe I got. So it's like, a true king will return, and Arondir's like, the history is always with us, and I'm like, all right. But I think for me, the most exciting prospect about that whole thing is that I think they're setting up Witch King of Angmar. Yeah. And I'm like, all right, I'm actually down. Go. I'm
here for that. Yeah.
I'm here for that. I would love to see. I think Halbrand is most definitely probably he's going to be one of the 9 rings that went to men and stuff like that. Like, I'm anticipating that, and I get it.
A lot of folks think that he's Theo's father.
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
I don't know.
Could who knows? But in terms of I think with that stuff, like it's again, like the stuff that I dislike about it isn't necessarily I'm more or less kind of just keeping a pessimistic eye on it, because I don't think we've seen enough for it to kind of come to fruition.
You've got some skeptical concerns.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
It's not quite. They haven't quite come out yet, but it's still possible they could go a different way that would really be disappointing.
Yep.
Yeah. I can understand that.
Yeah. Well, what did you think? What did you think of it?
I did get that vibe with you. I didn't pick up on the incel idea, but I can see that. I tend to focus on particular things like, does this guy, is he interesting? Talking about Arondir and the doomed love affair thing. I like that, again, for me, it was about the tone. Are they going to get the tone right? And when I first saw that in the trailers, that it looked like they were going that way with another human elf romance idea, which was very rare in Tolkien's world. I thought, okay, that could be extremely cheesy and extremely gooey, or it could be well done. And so far, I haven't been disappointed. I feel like it's understated enough to not be over the top and goofy and all that. And it's not a whole lots of, you know, endless, kind of like was it Feely and Tauriel.
Yeah.
That one, it was understated. It was unnecessary, but there it was. You know, okay, but at least they didn't get, you know, ooey gooey with it and get, or, you know, ridiculous with it. They kept it Tolkien-y, which is very much high-minded, not a whole lot of, you know, bump and grind or any of that kind of stuff involved. And I was worried about that. I was worried about that. There was this big hubbub about how they hired an intimacy expert who, I think there was this concern they were going to introduce all kinds of Games of Thrones types, you know, sex and nudity and all that kind of jazz. And I was like, you better not.
Yeah.
I'm going to rage monster at you if you do that. But thankfully they didn't do that. I thought character of, I was just going to say, I thought the character of Bronwyn was pretty interesting. And well acted, and I really like Arondir. I like that very sort of stoic, calm, focused, courageous. I was into that character. I thought he was interesting. And then of course, he gets ganked by the orcs at the end of the second episode. I was like, oh, okay, all right, maybe he'll get out of that mess. I'm sure he will.
He will. Most definitely. Well, you bring up the relationship, right? And in the beginning of the show, actually, there was something that I picked up on when Elrond is writing the script for Galad. I always mispronounce that. Another elf comes over and says, like, we have news for you. You're not invited to the council because it's for elf lords only. So I guarantee you they're going to play up this half elven thing with him in terms of his kind of overall place in the structure of elven lorddom, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if they investigate that with Arondir also.
Yeah, they could, because he's a Sylvan elf.
Yep.
And for those of you that don't know what that means, it means that they have never seen Valinor. Unless I'm way off on that, I'm pretty sure that means that they stayed in Middle Earth after birth, and they have never seen Valinor. So whereas the other types of elves have been there and came back, and now they're feeling the pull again and all that sort of stuff. Speaking of Valinor, I loved everything they did with Valinor. Just the imagery and the music, I really bought it. That scene at the boat where she turns, I thought was very just beautifully shot. And with the glow and all that kind of jazz and the music and the birds and all that kind of thing. And then she jumps into the water to make that huge decision. There's a lot of parallels between that first business with her as a child and the stone and the boat that gets repeated. I'm wondering if they're going to kind of do a leitmotif of that throughout the story. Now, that brings up Finrod's advice for her. I thought that was very psychologically interesting. The only way to know the difference between the light and the dark is to touch the dark. That's got a real strong Jungian flavor to it, if you ask me. But what did you think when you heard that?
I enjoyed it. Again, so much of it is like, I'm just like, don't screw this up.
Don't screw this up.
Don't screw this up. Don't. But that's and it's like the power of Tolkien, right? I mean, like a lot of his work, it's based off of very deep, you know, kind of metaphysically oriented ideas, right? Faith, hope, friendship, you know, facing the dark, even though you probably know you're going to lose type thing, courage, bravery, all of it.
Yeah.
Don't
and we
make
haven't
it about
seen
the super. Yeah.
I was going to say, we haven't seen anywhere near enough to know whether they're going to stick to that.
Right.
I would think they would be insane not to stick with that. And given that they'd had Tolkien's grandson there to advise them on this stuff, you know, that would be a royal screw up. But hey, we've seen that before, right?
Oh, yeah.
We had a whole sequel trilogy without Han, Leia, and Luke together in one bloody scene. So clearly, sometimes they don't know what the hell they're doing.
Yeah. Well, Amazon's track record with translating books to TV. I mean, Wheel of Time, I've read it. I wasn't a huge fan, but I watched the show also, and I was just like, whoa, what are you doing? Like why?
Yeah.
Like, why? Yeah.
As much as, like I said, as much as I like fantasy, I heard so much negative about that, and I haven't read the series either. I'm like, maybe I'll watch it, maybe I won't. I mean, and then, same with Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
I shied away from the TV show because I'm not a huge fan of like graphic rape scenes and stuff. And so,
Yeah.
but then the folks that I knew that were watching it said, don't bother. They screwed it up in the last couple of seasons, and that'll just ruin it for you. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
No blood, no foul, I guess. Now I have read some of the Game of Thrones books, as we talked about here. But then, and I have every bit of respect for Martin, but what he's going for is just not my jam.
Yeah.
He's going for morally gray, really dark consequences, and no matter what you do, there's going to be chaos and mayhem, and it's kind of nihilistic feel to it. And yes, it's realistic, but I prefer Tolkien's vision. Maybe I'm just fooling myself, but got an optimistic view, the same that he did. And that guy saw some stuff, and we've mentioned many times on the show, and still wound up with a very strongly pious faith about the universe.
Yep.
And I really respect that. So I want them to stick to that with the show, or else I'm going to be really pissed off.
Well, that's the core of what it is. And I think you bring up a really good point about that. I mean, I shared that article with you. And
yes, great article.
I don't know do you want to talk about that later on, or do we want to still go through some stuff? So maybe we leave that. But no, but I completely agree with you. I think it's the essence of what Tolkien is, right? His writing, the core of it is that kind of naturalistic optimism, but also the understanding of the human spirit, or his understanding of the human spirit, or the spirit of the world for that matter. I think that needs to shine through this. And I actually read a few negative reviews about Rings of Power that were discussing just that. Like, the reason why they didn't like it was because it was like it talked about they felt like it was discussing or presenting them with faith and meaning and fate. And I'm like, guys, if you're reviewing that negatively because of all that, that's why I'm in it. Like, that's why I'm in it. I want to see that. I want to see the core of what Tolkien was shine through.
That doesn't make much sense as far as
right.
Like, there's a guy who completely missed the point.
Yeah. Right. Right. Because that's what Tolkien is, right? That's what his writing is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. That's everything revolves around that for him. I mean, he's even said as much. It's a very Catholic. It's a very spiritual work, unconsciously at first, and then later consciously so.
Yep.
We got to talk about the dwarves at least. Any thoughts about the dwarves? I absolutely love the dwarves.
Yeah, that was probably Elrond and Durin were probably my favorite part of the show so far.
I love the new character Disa. She's a very likable character. Just easy to get behind. Her. She's funny, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of her, but definitely more of Durin. Incidentally, the actor's name is Owain Arthur. I mean, can you get much more Welsh than that? That is a Welsh name. And then I believe the actress that plays Galadriel is Welsh too. Anyway, so that was cool. But yeah, no complaints there really. I'm just curious on where they're going to take this. I'm real interested in what they did the whole Pulp Fiction thing. What's in there? What's in the chest? There's a speculation abounds. Is it mithril? Is it one of those dwarven rings? They've already been made. I don't think it's that, because they haven't made the rings yet. But it's probably mithril. I'm guessing. Celebrimbor hasn't made the door to Moria that has the magic runes on it, and they're made from mithril, so they haven't discovered yet that secret, I suppose. So overall impression, final thoughts before we get into the cultural side of this.
I like the way it looked. I'm
skeptically optimistic.
Very skeptically optimistic. I just the writing. I think the writing. Yeah, just work on the writing and really just. I see. You brought up trust, and I think that given what they've said and given what is, there's been a lot of, we feel like this is what Tolkien was saying, and it's like, he literally didn't say that, but all you're saying is you feel like that's what he's saying, and that's where I have the biggest issue. It's like, just be upfront about it. Don't try to deceive a fan base that is very much probably the most invested fan base out of any fantasy, any story, any of it. Just
It's
because
certainly the nerdiest fan base of all.
oh
Like,
yeah,
scholars like invested
Star
heavily.
Wars don't have scholars that get degrees, right? In Tolkien, which is another conversation in and of itself. I honestly think it can get really effing ridiculous. This guy, a beautiful work, like, and I think it was, and for somebody who had the life experience that he did, you can't separate his work and what he said with who he was as a person.
No.
And I also think that if you are going to try to adapt it, it's impossible to get everything out of it and have it word for word, scene for scene, picture for picture, all of it.
I'd love to see that, but I don't think it's going to happen.
But I think that the farther they stray away from the source material and make it something modern, the more it's going to lose touch with, I would argue, the fan base, but also anybody new that's watching it, because then it just becomes a really nice looking kind of modern fantasy that isn't Tolkien. It's Tolkien. It's not even Tolkien light at that point. So yeah.
Well, it's all boils down to trust, really, because from what I've read of the showrunners, they wanted to try to keep modern politics out of it. They're saying that they want to make it true to the spirit of Tolkien. So I'm hoping that they stick with that. Because that's what worked for Peter Jackson. That's what's going to make the big buku bucks. So why wouldn't they? And it's also what people want. They don't want to get into all of that political stuff. Again, that's spirit of the times, not spirit of the depths. Tolkien wrote from the depths. He intuitively, or maybe even unconsciously, understood what the issue of the day was, and it was dealing with power and how it corrupts, and that the only way that we're going to save ourselves is through the small acts of kindness, as represented by the hobbits. My impression so far is that I think the complaints about the writing, I noticed that at first too, that all the jumping around and everything, and I can understand why. Because they're going for this massive narrative and they're jumping across the whole continent with different characters. I've heard people say, I wish they'd have spent more time on each one. And I've heard other people say, I wish they'd have intercut more quickly. So, I mean, that's, I guess, a matter of taste. I'm more of the former camp. I think it would have been nice to spend more time in the individual plot lines rather than throw them all at the beginning, but it is an approach to storytelling. And that's, it's just one of those storytelling choices you have to make, and there's no easy answer to it.
Yeah.
I think it's probably going to get better over time, as long as they don't introduce even more plot lines and even more side quests and even more, all that stuff. If they stick with who they've got so far, they've got more than enough to play with. And so I'm very pleased with what I've seen so far, but I do have that kind of nagging doubt in the back of my mind, that kind of the way you do, which might be louder in your head than mine, but nevertheless, it's still there of, don't screw this up. This is good so far. It's not perfect, but so I would give what I've seen so far, I'd give it about 8 rings out of 10.
Okay. Right. I'd probably give it 6. But
six hobbits out of a shire.
It's interesting you said that, because I was like, in my head, I'm like, all right, Dr. Goodwin, you're definitely like 80-20, where I'm like 60-40. Yep. Like, yeah, that's pretty much where we're both at.
That was an accurate assessment. That can change at any moment.
Yep. Oh yeah.
With each episode, I'm like, you better not screw this up. I'm giving you plenty of leeway here. I understand you've got a lot of challenges in telling this, but this is really stuff. So that kind of cues us right into the cultural piece of this, and why people get so bloody enraged. It's a fucking TV show, people. Come on, right? Give it a rest. And yet, it gets to the point of shrieking and insanity. And the people that would just rant on it for hours about how awful it is, nitpicking every single piece. Those are the people with the trust level that's zilch. But what do these people owe them? I mean, it's the question I have. I mean, it's just a show. If you don't like it, there's this thing called turning it off. But
Sure.
but nevertheless, there they are, right? And there's a, on a certain level, I think it's just outrage sells, clickbait. So there's probably a lot of that. But what's the source of the emotion behind this? And before you answer, right, I do want to share that I think this whole situation reminds me very much of the prequel trilogy of Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
The expectations for them were so ridiculously high. I don't know that George Lucas could have produced much of anything that wouldn't have pissed off everybody, at least half of the audience at least. And being George Lucas, he's got a 10 ear for dialogue, and he was in charge of all of that this time around. You wound up with mountains of rage. And this was the beginning of the internet, so that you couldn't have people on YouTube making 4-hour videos about how much they hated the prequel trilogy. Well, now you do. And you had people doing that for The Last Jedi, for example. Okay, but funny enough, now people think of the prequels as pretty okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, that's pretty cool. They had a great story structure, some great ideas, themes. They're great, not perfect, And so I'm wondering if we're in another situation like this, where the outrage is so ridiculous, but will it last?
Yeah.
It depends on what they do with it, really. But what are your thoughts on that, though?
I agree. I think people are just way too invested in being.
Isn't that interesting?
I think they're invested with being almost like they're so invested with the content that they consume. It's a self-identification with it. It's like, this has to be exactly how it matches up. I think the beauty of Tolkien is that he was an exemplar of what imagination can do.
Yeah.
Right. And people don't look at that and say, well, what is that in my own life? And how can I inspire that in my own life?
Disconnected from reality.
Absolutely disconnected, but disconnected with their own kind of internal, that internal compass, their own unconscious, their own ability to be a wellspring for creativity in their life. And it's an over-identification with the material. It's an over-identification with it to the extent where, look at it. I look at it this way. Of course, $1 billion monopoly of a company of Amazon, like, if you think about this, is going to try to get an IP that's going to make them a ton of money, and they're going to do whatever they can to appeal them. It's like that old saying: if you love everything, you love nothing, right?
Mm.
Right. And that's what Amazon is. It's a company that tries to appeal to literally everybody to make as much profit as possible. Yeah. This isn't, of course, it's not going to be, the works of Tolkien. Like, yeah. I knew that at the onset. Like, I remember the first time that they came out with like a teaser. It wasn't really a teaser. It was the map, and everybody was like, "Oh my God, it's the map! It's a second age map. It's the map." And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. It's awesome. Like, I would love to see it, and when I have time, I'll watch it, and this, that, and the other. Do I appreciate the modern kind of insert of politics and all that stuff? Not at all. At all. And I think most people, when they're watching it, regardless of where you lie, are just like, yawn, like, come on, we don't need this. But I really do think it's an over-identification with, it's this needs to fill this need for me, and if it's not perfect, then there's something missing, right? Yeah. But they're looking at it from the wrong way. These collective ideas,
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it too. What you mentioned. This is filling a need.
Yeah.
And the need is so intense. Why is that there? Why do we have such intense hunger for these stories? All right. Doesn't that tell us something about the spirit of the depths, or the spirit of the times even? That's a whole conversation right there. Why are people investing so much in fictional universes? Is it escapism? Is it, because there's all these videos about Easter eggs and references and connections and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just as guilty as everybody else. I love those stupid things. All right, I listen to those. I watch them. They're fun. They're fun, but it's not like life or death for me. You know, I think it's fun to see the connections there. They've got these for the Rings of Power out there now, of course, and they're fun. But what's going on with on the deeper level that people would get so enraged if it isn't perfect, if it isn't what I think it should be, as if, like you say, if I identify with it, I feel like it's mine, my own, my precious, you know, and it has to be the way I want it, or else, you know, and you know, good luck with that.
Yeah.
To me, it is very, I don't know, wrong-headed. I grew up in the age where you get what you get, right? If there's some new movie that came out and it's not perfect, well, it's all we got. So, you know, you better like it.
Yeah. Well, it's not also to say that there isn't any kind of onus on Amazon and what they're doing. And, you know, kind of, if the potential there is to kind of propagandize an IP, I mean, I fully believe that, of course, they're going to do that. Like, every company does it now, you know, and it's.
Oh, and I bet that these channels that do the Easter egg videos and all that kind of stuff, they're probably sponsored by Amazon on some level.
Maybe, yeah.
Why wouldn't they be? Because it's basically getting more people talking about it, getting more people interested and drawn into it. And it just so happens that I find it fun, but I'm not naive about that. I know that there's probably behind that. You know, and it may be that those people are genuine or not. I don't know or really care. You know, but that begs the question of the trust level again. Is when I see a positive review about it, if I immediately start thinking, well, you know, they're just bought and paid for by Amazon. The problem is that Amazon is such a big, monstrous juggernaut, and so people are just going to automatically assume that.
Yeah,
and I'm not a huge fan of, you know, I try to avoid shopping on Amazon myself because it's just so big. But but with this is Tolkien, you know, and I'm in, right? They just got me. They got me.
Right.
So I have to just, okay, all right, here we are.
Well, I think you just said something that really should, if anybody's watching this and you're kind of like on the really just on the obsessive side of all this.
Yeah.
You literally just said something that should resonate with everybody in regards to like the cultural conversation of the show. I try to avoid buying things from Amazon because this is equally just a product as anything else, you know. And like I told you this, I really do hope that if people are, you know, starting to watch this, that they decide to go back to the source material and read. That is my one horse in the race when it comes to this stuff, is that the socio-political stuff is going to be there. We live in 2022, and of course it is. And I think that, I hope that eventually we get to a point where we don't have to have these kind of superficially driven woke whatever it is in our media all the time. It's just saturated in it. If there's anything you take out of it, read The Hobbit. Go read The Hobbit. Go read The Lord of the Rings after that. Read The Silmarillion. Read the Unfinished Tales. Read all of it. Read all of it.
So that's a great question. I had a lot of notes set up for that discussion of the wokeness.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So that's a great segue in. You know, and people I think opinions are going to vary here, because what the term woke has become so amorphous that hardly anybody knows what it means anymore. It's just sort of one of these words like, that's communist, you know. Okay, what is that, you know? So, but nevertheless, I think it does have some kind of a meaning, and I think of it as, if something gets labeled that pejoratively, it means what they're saying is it's got a superficial political narrative behind it that's structuring the events of the story in such a way that's preachy and annoying. And so my litmus test for that then is to ask myself, if I'm wondering if that's the case, I'll say, okay, is this woke, meaning, like, say, is this sexist, or is this, you know, violently anti-sexist, or you know, reverse sexist, or whatever it is? Well, if that were the case, then A, B, and C, right? So there would be no female characters that had anything to learn because they had all the answers, for example, in the case of a sexist accusation. And you can definitely say that about most of the Star Wars trilogy, that the most prominent female characters in them, like Leia and Admiral Holdo and Rey and Rose Tico, they don't really need to learn anything because they know everything and they're teaching the male characters stuff, right? So okay, that could fit. That could fit as being excessive in that realm, like being overly one-dimensional, or one-sided. In the same way that shows back in the 50s used to do it the other way around, where the women were the goofballs and they needed a strong man to teach them the ways of the wisdom, and all that. And of course, we don't want either one of those narratives anymore. Nobody wants to hear that stuff anymore. But nobody wants to hear the other side of it either, because it's just as bad. It's just as bad. So then I look at this and I think, I'm not really seeing that so much myself, because as I understand the way they're doing the story, Galadriel has a lot to learn, and it may be Elrond who teaches her to turn her ways around and not be quite so Feanorian in her drivenness. She's strongly and completely inspired by her brother, who is a male. So there's that. Now, I don't know about Disa yet. Right now, she just seems like a balancing character. She may not be, a front character enough to warrant that in-depth treatment of a character arc. Bronwyn may have some things to learn. I don't know. She doesn't seem to be able to just do whatever she wants, because that one orc I really love that scene too, where they have the orc that's just wreaking havoc. Just one orc, right? And we're used to seeing Aragorn kill 15 orcs in 10 seconds, right? Which is total badass, but
I'll end you.
Yeah, exactly, right? And he just goes out there and he whips out the swords. All right, we're all going down. All you Mojacks are toast. But we're kind of bringing it down to like the regular Joes, right? What is it? One orc is going to give him a lot of trouble, So that fight was cool. I like that. I don't really see that so much in terms of male female. Arondir, he's noble, he's fierce, he's courageous, he's brave, he's capable of tenderness and love and all that kind of thing. He doesn't have much to learn so far. And so it seems like those characters are pretty well balanced. As far as the race thing goes, all right, so now here's a can of worms. I think, number one, a lot of people get upset about people who have not lily white skin in fantasy material like this have a somewhat skewed vision of the medieval period in Europe, because we're going to say, oh yes, it's fantasy, yes, it's elves and dwarves and all that kind of jazz, but it's based on medieval Europe for the most part. And at that time, it was all white people, right? But it wasn't actually. There are some very interesting historical references to Christians from Africa. There's like a 12th, I remember I dug up a couple of interesting sources on this. So there was a knight named Robert de Clary who wrote about a wealthy Nubian king who lived in Constantinople. He had a cross branded on his forehead, as many Nubian Christians did at that time. 13th century. And he and many others from sub-Saharan Africa liked to go on pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. So it would have still been mostly fair-skinned individuals in Europe at the time, sure, but there were still plenty of people from other areas, from Ethiopia, Syria, Armenia, Georgia, Nubia. So the idea that it should just be completely all light-skinned people is actually historically not right. So I don't really cringe that much and immediately think, race politics when I see something like that. As far as like the elves and the dwarves, I'm like, they're fantasy creatures, so whatever. That doesn't bother me too much. Not to mention, of course, as we've talked about before, the idea of whiteness as a ethnicity is a deeply flawed idea. Right? You're German or Irish or you're Scottish or whatever. Whiteness is a colonial term. At the medieval period, people didn't care about that. They cared about your religion. that was way more important than your skin color.
Mm.
You know, so that kind of stuff, I shrug at. I shrug. I know a lot of people get really bent out of shape over that kind of thing. Well, hell, I mean, there's Yasuke, the African samurai, 15th century or 16th century. I don't know if you've heard of him, but there was I believe he was Sudanese, maybe, who was brought over to Japan, and he stayed there. So, I mean, if someone, you know, there's been outrages over shows that are fantasy shows because so and so is you know, African ancestry or whatever, and like, oh, it's woke. Not necessarily.
Well, I
What are your
think
thoughts on that?
I think for me, it's not about like, I think it's the mythology, right? If you were to make a movie about, you know, the Prose Edda and, you know, have somebody of a different color playing Odin, I think
Right.
you know, it would kind of be
That
like,
would be
well,
weird.
it'd be weird, right? Or
Yeah,
King
that'd be
Arthur,
weird.
King Arthur not being white, you know,
Yeah.
or you know, Anglo-Saxon or Welsh, you know.
Yeah.
So I think like that's I understand that. I can understand, you know, and I think it's the same thing if you were to have you getting to certain Japanese mythology, you'd expect that those characters, you know, just like the Japanese developed that mythology to be Japanese,
Yeah.
to a certain degree. So I can
Or at least
understand.
Chinese, or, you know,
Yeah, right.
something
Yeah.
related. Yeah.
So I get it. I think like the issue is with this is that it's fantasy material that is built off of certain mythologies that were prevalent in Western Europe, right? So the Kabbalah, it was based off of certain, I mean, Beowulf, Anglo-Saxon Saxon mythology, different Germanic mythology, Celtic mythology, all of it. And, you know, it's an abstraction away from the core mythological abstraction of the peoples in that area. And for me, it's just like, well, if you wouldn't race swap, whatever you want to call it, with a mythology from a different part of the world, why do you need to do it here? Why is it necessary, right? I'm not too concerned with it. That again, like if you're really getting upset about a massive company doing this, right, you're really missing the point. That you're really missing, like, you shouldn't be that up. Like, I can understand it. I can understand it if, like, let's say for instance, at a certain point they try to cancel Tolkien, right, and his works, and claiming that he was a racist or whatever it is. Like,
it's been done.
It's been done, and it's I think it might, you know, who knows what's going to happen in the coming years. I just for me, I think it's a very slippery slope in both directions.
Yeah. You know, and some of the, well, I can definitely, you know, see partially maybe where they're coming from, but if, you know me, I'm a stickler for definitions. And if we're going to say somebody is black, say, for example, say the actor who plays Arondir. Well, but is he though? I mean, he's Ishmael Cordova is Spanish, so he may have some Moorish ancestry. You know, he's just got some vaguely dark skin. Or does that qualify as black or white? You know, I mean, this is American post-colonial politics trying to shoehorn this label onto somebody that it may not even really fit, for good or bad, right? For either way that you look at it. So like Bronwyn, she is Iranian, you know, ancestry herself. And I'm sure that there was plenty of people that completely missed that and thought she was white, you know, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, just because she happened to have fairly light skin. So that's what bugs me about that kind of stuff. You know, like you say, if you have someone who is Indian playing Odin, it would take a really strange stretch of imagination to make sense out of that.
Right.
But people of the Southlands having, you know, a variety of different skin tones, they're near the Harad, you know, it's explainable within universe. But, you know, as you said, Tolkien being accused of being racist and all that, of course, that's been done. I think we're talking about a guy in the early 20th century from, you know, Oxford. And he had a way of looking at the world that I think could be retroactively looked at as if it were racist, but I'm not sure it fits exactly.
I mean, there's so many different races in all of his work, right?
Right.
I mean, elves, men, dwarves, hobbits.
Right. I've heard this complaint about the Shivi show, in that the Harfoots all have Irish accents, and therefore that's prejudice against the
I guess
Irish,
Irish.
because they are all, they're dirty and they're, kind of lowbrow, and they're like, so
But
what? They're
I think
cool. I like them.
it's like, yeah, and it's like these conversations can go on and on and on about
Yeah,
all
they
this.
get
It's
really
never
confusing.
ending. I think people, again, it's like, don't become so you need it to be what you expect it to be, so
Yeah.
much so,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Tolkien actually, I remember there's a famous story about him where he was approached by the German publishers. Was it Rutten and Lunig? Right after he published The Hobbit, and they were asking him, we'll publish The Hobbit. This is a German company during 1938, right? So they were that way, and they said, do you have, what is your ancestry? Are you pure Aryan, right? And in one of the letters, now we're not sure if he actually sent these letters, but he wrote 2 copies of a response to this, and and they were full of sarcasm. It was pretty funny. He said, number 1, your definition of Aryan is wrong. Aryan means Iranian, so no. Maybe you're asking me if I'm Jewish. And he said, if that's the case, I can only say I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. And then he told them in no uncertain terms to go play with themselves. And, so is that a guy who sounds, racist and all that? And he complained that it was hard to be proud of my, German heritage when you idiots act like this. He called Hitler a ruddy imbecile in one of his letters, all that stuff. So, not to mention he was one of the original Antifa OGs out there on the trenches. So, you could say, well, that's World War II, Dr. G, not World War I, but you know what I mean? You know what I mean? He was there. He was there for it. His view was probably rather complicated and not easily lumped into racist or whatever it is that isn't racist. Yeah. So there's that. So that just seems to me like a complete dead end. Like it's just going to go on and never end. It's a rabbit hole that has no exit. Not that it's, it's worth talking about, I think, but as long as you can keep it real. But it often goes off into the deep end of just ideologies yelling at each other, and there's no nuance anymore. It's completely lost, which is very frustrating. So so far they've tried, they're saying that they are trying to stay out of politics and just stay true to the spirit of the work, and I've not seen any evidence to the contrary of that so far. We'll see. Again, we'll see.
Fingers crossed. Well, I think if you keep, I think tradition's important. But if tradition it closes you off to the extent where we've seen it, right? If tradition, keep to the tradition, but as long as it's pretty much, I don't want to say open to everybody. Well, open, but true to the heart of the tradition of Tolkien, right?
Yeah. The essence of it.
Yeah.
And the essence are those things you mentioned earlier, that emphasis on hope and faith and the reality of evil, right? Not saying it's just a perspective or a point of view, and all that. Yeah. It's like, no, evil's real. It's a real problem, and it's not quite as powerful as good, but it's really darn powerful. And if you don't watch out, you're going to get corrupted before you even know what hit you.
First line, I actually really enjoyed the intro to this show, was nothing at its beginning is evil.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed that, actually. But and to kind of get back to like why people are here type thing. Why are we in this situation where it has to be this either or? It's like me versus them. We brought up Game of Thrones earlier, and I wouldn't be surprised if people gravitate more to that, or they have been gravitating more to that. And it is because like there are lines like, I must destroy my enemies like the fires of the dragon within me, right? And The only character, if you were to find a character in Tolkien to say something like that, would probably be a villain, right?
Feanor.
Yeah, right, exactly. And
Yeah.
and I think it's we live in such polarizing times that even when, because I found myself doing this, like initially, like before I even watched the show, I said, okay, like I'm not expecting anything good to come out of this. This is probably going to be garbage. Like I'm not, this and the other.
Yeah.
But then afterwards, I was like, no, there are definitely things that I actually enjoy about this, and I'm hoping will come to fruition and work out, and the story will, be fleshed out. But we live in times where people just are so staunch and static in needing to know that they're on this side, and then everything else is on this side, and it's so, I'm going to swear here, it's fucking unhealthy, right? It's
oh yeah,
unhealthy.
You're absolutely right. It's
And,
that polarization. It's I think a very intense form of tribalism. You and I, we've talked a little bit about my some of my work that I've been doing lately on the social dimensions of mental illness. I think this is a big part of that, about how you have so much anomie and so much feelings of meaninglessness and emptiness and not belonging and disconnection and all that kind of thing. And this is a drug. This attitude of all or nothing, us and them. It's in our politics. It's in all this discussions about TV shows and movies. The internet has amplified this. A certain president who was elected in the last term certainly cranked this up to 11.
The president now.
The president now is not helping matters.
Is not helping at all.
I would have hoped, but here we are.
Yeah.
And so it's a mess.
Yeah.
It's a mess, and that's just, I think, probably evidence of that. It's a reaction, that feeling of, I have to know who my team is. I have to know who my tribe is. And here's one of the lines we're going to draw, right? We love this, we hate that. Yeah. And that's the end of it. It's all or nothing.
What do you think Tolkien would have said in response to, if he were to live today, right? What do you think he would have said, or what do you think his response to all of it would have been?
All of the fuss and bother over the TV show?
Well, the TV show, but that polarization.
Oh, wow. I think he probably would have likened it to the actions of Anatar, the deceiver, the gift giver. He divides. He turns his enemy factions on each other. So it's less work for him, divide and conquer, I think that's probably what he would do. He liked to use references to his own work, but that makes sense, right? This is how he saw it. There were certain kinds of people that were orcish in his estimation. The type, right? And so I think that's probably what he would do in this case, and say that these are the times are turning people on each other in a way that's just ridiculous. And his story was about all these disparate cultures coming together to defeat the common foe and getting past their differences, the elves and the dwarves fighting together after having been enemies for so long, et cetera, et cetera. For Tolkien, though, that did not mean let's all just erase the differences between us and all be one thing. That would be the opposite of good, in his opinion, because that's what Sauron did.
Yep. And
Sauron, all of those, you're all just orcs now. You're just all, it's this tyrannical monism.
Yep.
And I don't remember if he said that exactly, but that is kind of the spirit of some of the things that he said. So that maintain the heritage and the diversity, that's a good, strong thing, but work together when you need to, and quit being boneheads.
Yeah. I think that's, you're exactly right. Yeah. He probably would have, I think he was very much a kind of vertical thinker in terms of, there's always I would say he would say it's an opportunity for the generations now to overcome this great evil of the kind of just making everything horizontal and nothing, right? Yeah. It's all the same, this flatland. And that's what the villains in his work try to do. And I think I think the best that the Rings of Power could possibly do is realize that,
Well, if we go by the prologue of the Fellowship of the Ring, which recaps a lot of this stuff, Sauron covers the world in darkness
Mhm.
until the battle, the last alliance of elves and men, which again, diverse groups coming together to fight a common enemy. And if that is the case, then we're looking at quite a bit of darkness ahead in this TV show.
Mhm.
But that's an opportunity to show those themes, to show that the light pierces that gloom in a particularly contrasty Tolkien-y way, you know, that has light and dark. And these are not just vague ideologies that can be, you know, argued around with sophistry. Saruman tries that, doesn't work.
Mhm.
They're real things, and they exist in his world. That's what makes it so beautiful and terrifying and inspiring all at once. Well, that's a great way to end it.
I think so.
I think
That was great.
we've
That was
beaten
good.
the subject to death, but you know, we're going to do more because we got more episodes ahead of us. We
I
got
think, yeah, I
28
think we,
episodes.
not to speak for everybody that watches your channel, but I think if everybody likes this, we'll review each one. I mean, I'm up for it. I think it'd be cool. I think it'd be cool.
Yep. And if not, well, then we're just going to be shouting into the void. So to hell with it.
Hello, 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 hello.
Yeah. Here's
How
what
are
we
you?
think.
How are you?
Nobody
How are
cares,
you?
but we're saying it anyway.
I love it. I love it. I love it.
All right.
Thank
That's
you.
what we got.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you having me on again.
Absolutely.
All right. I'll see you next
So
time.
long, folks.
All right. Bye, guys.
We'll see you.
Bye.